Good morning. I'm harleysch from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for June 13th, 2024. I hope you had a chance to join us live yesterday for the Schiller Institute's emergency press conference on the danger of nuclear war is real and it must be stopped. The panel was a distinguished panel, included eloquent speeches by Scott Ritter, Colonel Richard Black, and Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. And a link to the video is in the description section below on today's update. Now, Helga Zepp-LaRouche also spoke. She's the founder of the Schiller Institute and the current chairwoman. And all four of them gave a clear message. The U.S. provocations against Russia are dangerous. The refusal to talk and negotiate is lunacy. And they made the point, don't expect a change until the American people demand it, because the leaders are completely under the control of the war hawks and the imperial forces of the City of London and Wall Street and the integrated corporate cartels that run the governments in these countries. Now, they compared the difference today to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was an extremely dangerous moment. But at that point, President Kennedy wisely conducted back-channel negotiations with the Russians to work out an agreement to remove the Soviet missiles in return for removing American missiles that were in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. The negotiations led to a limited nuclear test ban treaty and an ongoing discussion process that continued even during the most perilous times of the Cold War. There were arms control negotiations, which led to the peaceful dismantlement of the Warsaw Pact after 1991. Now, Ritter, Black, and Wilkerson are all military veterans. And they warned that the U.S. military is not prepared for either a nuclear war or prolonged conventional war. U.S. industry and its economy is not up to the task. In fact, the deindustrialization policy has weakened the U.S. ability to keep up, even though we have a nearly $1 trillion defense budget. And more importantly, they said the population is unprepared for what's about to hit. They used the term sleepwalking into World War III. Now, for her part, Helga Zepp-LaRouche emphasized that the economic policies that are behind this represent a collapse or are causing a collapse of the Western economies. They're debt-ridden. The need for new loot to balance their books is overwhelming and leading to an expansion of the predatory looting. But they're running into problems, which is the refusal of the nations of the Global South to continue the old colonial policies of the imperial powers. What we're seeing is the emergence of a new order, a rejection of the unipolar imperial order, a new order based on sovereign nations negotiating for the interests of their people, as opposed to subordinating their policies to the rapacious need for loot from the predatory cartels. The examples she gave were the Belt and Road Initiative of China, the BRICS Alliance, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was highlighted in the recent conference of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, where there was ongoing deal-making on transportation, on energy, on trade, on how to move away from the weaponization of the dollar. And engaged in this were all nations except the transatlantic nations. So if one calls for a diplomatic solution in the transatlantic nations, you're called a Putin puppet or a Kremlin stooge. Now, an example of this insanity was the inflection point column by Frederick Kemp, who's the CEO of the Atlantic Council. And for those who don't know, the Atlantic Council is one of those think tanks heavily funded by military, industrial, financial complex corporations and foundations, but also the UK Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the State Department, the Defense Department. In other words, the think tank, which is shaping a policy of support for these wars is funded by the US and UK governments. In yesterday's column, Kemp warned that Putin may be preparing a surprise to coincide with the upcoming July 9th and 10th NATO summit. He said that NATO should preempt Putin with a surprise of its own, such as lifting all restrictions on the use of NATO's weapons against Russia. This is precisely the lunacy that was condemned in the speeches by Wilkerson, Ritter, and Helga. Now, leaders such as Kemp are part of this media think tank blob, which are not only engaged in pushing a pro-war narrative, but in censorship and intimidation of forces that disagree. As I mentioned, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the UK is involved in this. Their use of cyber warfare to counter opposition is praised on their website. For example, they write about the Digital Research Forensic Lab, which is supposedly to counter disinformation, but in reality, it's one of the more prolific producers of disinformation to keep the line going that it's an unprovoked attack from Russia on Ukraine, that if the West doesn't provide enough weapons and money to Ukraine, that Putin will overrun Europe. And they have so-called experts who testify to this every single day in conferences at the fanciest hotels in Washington, New York, Berlin, and Brussels. Now, what Ritter said in his presentation, which you should think about, he said, the greatest threat to us is American nuclear weapons policy. He knows this as a weapons inspector, as one who is involved in the decommissioning of the nuclear programs in the former Soviet states. Wilkerson also emphasized this point, that if we don't change the way we're going, sooner or later, by accident or by intent, there'll be a nuclear war. And the leaders who are pushing these provocations in Washington and London and Brussels are thinking about how to win a nuclear war. Now, the reality is, again, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche emphasized, that the world is rejecting the unipolar order. They're saying we have our sovereign rights and we're going to stand up for the rights of our people against these predatory corporate cartels. It's time for you to join us to break the US and Europe out from under the control of this pro-war faction into an alliance for cooperation with other sovereign nation states for peaceful development. I'm linking today the video of the press conference yesterday, so you can watch and see what these leaders were saying, why it's important that you not merely watch, but you become actively involved in the process. Don't rely on a political leader. We've seen the promises broken over and over. People who intend to do what's right end up committing crimes against the American people based on their own ambition and their own greed, and in some cases being blackmailed. So become informed, become involved. Since tomorrow is Friday, I'll be taking your questions and comments. You can send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. I'll also be linking Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 Fundamental Principles, which provide the basis for how to escape the kind of lunacy that's dominating Western policy today. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope you'll participate in our discussion tomorrow.
The big question, what can we do about it? If we have the power to influence the course of history as individuals, then each of us has a corresponding moral responsibility to muster from within ourselves those capacities which enable us to do our part in shaping the course of civilization. Now, under that rubric, I say, what kind of news is newsworthy? The only news that's worth having is news which performs those functions, which enables government, which enables you as an individual and so forth, better to understand what is happening to this planet, to understand what the developments are that are shaping the course of history, and finally to indicate to you the facts which you need to look at so that you can judge what it is that you might be able to do which can contribute to bringing about a solution, an escape from the collapse of civilization. This is no pipe dream, this is no fantasy, this is real.